Hi, I'm Praveen Swamy, and I'm National Security Editor of ThePrint. Thank you for joining us. We have with us today Dr. Rahul Sagar, who's just brought out a fantastic book on how essentially 19th century Indians saw themselves. And the reason this is a sort of big contribution is we know a lot about the ways in which the British saw us. We don't know quite that much about Indians, how Indians saw themselves. There's been some writing on how people in Mughal courts, for example, saw the courtly world and high politics around them. Some writing later of collections of nationalist thought, but very little on an Indian worldview through that 19th century and of course, to the freedom movement. So thank you for joining us, Rahul. My first question would then really be this. How did 19th century Indians really understand themselves to be? Were they subjects of an empire, leaving one empire, as it were, and joining another, ending up in another? Or was there such a thing as an Indian nationalist consciousness or nationalist thought before the dawn of the national movement itself?
Thanks, Praveen. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that excellent opening question. The 19th century surprised me. When I began first reading and working in the area, I came with a lot of the assumptions that you had mentioned, that really there was not much there. It was a desert. People were kind of wandering about, shell-shocked at the transition from one empire to another, and not really able to make much sense of the world around them. And really all that fundamentally happened was social reform began haltingly, and something happened, and then there was the mutiny, something happened, and eventually the freedom movement began, and that's when history began. So I walked into it with, I think, this common view that many people have, and I was surprised and then shocked and then astounded by what I found. So to answer your question, yes, Indians in the 19th century did have a sense, starting in the very first decade, that there was some sort of broader national set of circumstances that they had to respond to. And one of the things in the book that I try and talk about is how the quest to have an English or a modern education was one of the very first, very clear nationwide, or signs of nationalism, where you had people in Calcutta or Bombay or Madras all saying at the same time, the reason we have been unable to really break free of this cycle of empire and kingdom after kingdom giving way and collapsing, and we don't have structures and institutions that work, is because we're simply not equipped for the modern world. And what we want is modern education, liberal education, to prepare us for this world. So already by this point, 1810s, 1820s, even before someone like Ram Mohan Roy, we are starting to see a broad awareness, historical awareness. How did we end up in this circumstance? Not just me, my kingdom, my caste, my group, my linguistic group. No, it's we. So I was amazed by that. And that's why I began the book with that kind of footing.
And these Indians are writing about a vast range of subjects, right? I mean, from foreign policy to economics. It's not navel gazing. It seems to be quite a broad understanding of the world and India's position in it. Would that be a fair summation?
Absolutely, yeah. So this was the second thing that really struck me, and that's what led to this particular book. I went in looking for evidence of thinking about national concerns, national politics. And I was surprised to find that there was actually a vast amount out there about international politics, about not just Asia, but about global concerns. And this was startling. But once I got into it, I realized it actually made a lot of sense. And here's the reason why. So starting at the end of the 18th century, so from about 1775 onwards, you start to get Indians that are basically becoming aware of Western European modernity, partly through the French, but particularly through the English. And one of the reasons for this is the English start to rely on translators or interpreters, dobashis, right? The people who speak do bhashas. And the dobashi educates usually his son and passes on this linguistic ability. And you get the beginnings of people, because they're working with English officers, reading English journals, reading English periodicals, being aware of the fact that there's such a thing as a public sphere outside the akhbar, outside just the news and the rumors, that there's actually reflection, thinking about why things have happened. This had happened in India. Certainly, Indian courts in the 18th century were places of great reflection and thinking, but it was a courtly culture. It wasn't a public culture. And this starts to change when people are exposed to this, broadly speaking, Western European, particularly English idea of the public sphere, of public culture debate amongst citizens and subjects as members of a broader public. And so that's what starts to be understood in India. And then, of course, when English education does turn up, you go from this small group that has exposure to this to a very large group. And they're reading periodicals. I mean, until Indians begin editing periodicals in the 1840s or 50s, for the first 30 or 40 years, they're reading English periodicals. They know what's happening in Panama. They know what's happening in Japan. They know what's happening in China, because they're reading these periodicals that track English interests across this wide spectrum of the globe.
So I just to draw you out over there, because it's quite fascinating. So this is not an elite speaking to itself. It's an elite speaking to a wider audience, as it were, to a nation that is yet to come into being. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, so what's starting to happen is, at the one level, as I was just describing, people are starting to think about global problems. They're starting to think about how global problems impact them. So, for example, the rise of the opium trade, or tariffs, or trade wars, or indeed, Indian troops being levied and then sent off to Abyssinia, or being sent off to Egypt. So they're starting to become aware of global problems. But that's not the only thing that's happening. There's enormous change within India on a couple of, in a material sense, not just in the world of ideas, but in the world of actual lived experience. The railways appear. Indian elites start to take on subordinate positions in British India. And another part of the story, a part that I'm particularly interested in and have subsequent work that Manu Pillai, for instance, or Robin Jeffrey have done, we tend to underestimate just how important Indian India, which is to say the princely states, were, and the web of connections that they had with the outside world, whether it's Mysore with the French, or Travancore with the French, or Rajasthan with its links into Afghanistan and so on. We underestimate how much interflow of knowledge, ideas, commodities there is in these regions as well, separately from British India. All of these, the movement of people, the appearance of this public sphere, later in the century, in the middle of the 19th century, the appearance of telegraph, right? The appearance of the telegraph fundamentally changes how Indians think about distance and the ability to connect, because what happens in Calcutta can be read in Travancore 2 days later, or sometimes the same day if it's sufficiently important. This is an astonishing change for people. And so that's why you get the circulation of journals, you get the circulation of periodicals and newspapers across the country. They can travel by train. So 5 days later, a periodical published in Madras turns up in Calcutta or in Lahore or in Delhi. And that means people now start addressing not just the elites in their neighborhood or their ruler or the local collector in a petition as they would have done before, but they start to address a wider audience.
No, sometimes I think Generation Z onwards imagines that communication was revolutionized by the internet. And I sometimes think of how bewildering this proliferation of information must have seemed in the 19th century. And what a huge intellectual task it must have been for these individuals to try and make sense of this dramatically changing world. But the 19th century Indians kind of got bad press, hasn't he, Rahul? You had the British, who were quite contemptuous and dismissive. And in Indian nationalist narratives, particularly over the last few decades, they've also been written off as sepoys, collaborators of various kinds. You don't seem to think that's a fair representation at all.
No, it's a gross misrepresentation, and we owe it to that century and to the people that lived in that century that struggled far more than any of us have or can imagine. We owe them a fair reckoning. And here's put yourself in the mind of someone particularly in the first half of the 19th century, right? Between 1775 and 1800, all of the southern part of India, the Deccan, basically sees the British expand, right? Mysore falls, Travancore falls, Tanjore falls. the Carnatic Wars end, and a vast swathe apart from the Nizam all come under British control. This is something that people have to absorb. They have to comprehend. It's not just simply that there is one set of rulers is passed over to another, but the speed, the ferocity, the sophistication of the people that they're now confronted with is immense. And from 1800 to 1825, all the great Maratha powers of central and northern India vanish as well, right? Well, not vanish, but I mean, vanquished is what I mean.
And just to give a sense of that time frame, that's in within a generation, within an individual's lifetime, these enormous changes take place.
I mean, absolutely. You're born and your parents tell you, I used to serve in such and such person's court as a khabari or a reporter or a judge or whatever it was. And by the time you're middle-aged, you've seen two sets of revolutions, and you no longer speak the language of the people that are ruling you. You have no technological ability to combat them or fight them. You are astonished by their control over the seas. You're astonished by their control over the military and their diplomatic skill and their ability to control finance. I mean, what's left to you? So when we think about Indians in this period, we have to understand we don't owe them sympathy. We owe them understanding that they lived in a world of radical, rapid change. People in Europe were astonished at the rate of change. The fact that you could have modern shipping, the fact that you could have modern forms of finance, the fact that you could have modern forms of communication. These were stunning to people in Europe. Imagine how stunning they were to people in India who basically jumped 100 years or jumped 75 years in the space of a decade or two. And what we should admire about them, we don't, as I was saying, we don't have to have sympathy for them, but when we understand them, we have to really come away with a sense of admiration that in the midst of this chaos, you've lost your hereditary income, you've lost your hereditary rulers, you've lost your hereditary structures, your social, economic, and political world are in turmoil. There is war around you. Thousands upon thousands die from famine, from, even at that point, somewhat preventable or avoidable disease. In the midst of all of that, people look up and say, I want an education. I want to understand how the modern world works. I want to come to grips with it. And I can work with these people to get there. I can use them while they're using me to understand what makes them tick and what's got them ahead of me. That's no small feat. There are very few civilizations and very few groups of people, when they've been confronted by outsiders and confronted by challenges that are so enormous, that have actually had the grace or the intelligence or the prudence to adapt. Adaptation is not easy. And you can't jump straight from adaptation into revolution. Usually that ends with you dying and everyone ending up exterminated.
We need to admire these people for their astounding intellectual transformation. Some of your critics would ask, perhaps let me rephrase that. I mean, one of the questions would be, did these 19th century Indian intellectuals place themselves in some kind of grand, self-conscious Indian narrative dating back to the Mauryan era, if not earlier? Or did they see themselves as vested with the historical responsibility of rethinking Indian tradition to cope with a new world?
I think there's a plurality of responses. You get both or more of the kinds of responses you mentioned. You certainly get those that sometimes are unfairly described as reactionaries or conservatives. They are people that have seen a way of life around them and are unprepared for, and in some cases, absolutely resistant to or reluctant to adapt or change. And so you can find, if you go looking for it, you can find defenses of sati, or you can find defenses of caste or things of that kind. But that group shrinks rapidly. It's a minority to begin with, and it shrinks rapidly. By the 1840s and 50s, you can hardly find that sort of argument very widespread, certainly in the English language world, which is the world that I talk about in this book, that I'm trying to draw attention to. Because it's not just simply that because people read English, they become denationalized. And that brings us to the second part of your concern. I think almost all the figures that read, study English, that travel abroad. That's another one of the facts in the book that I talk about, that, yes, Indians prior to the 19th century have not really traveled abroad much. And suddenly you get people taking the most audacious gambles, running away from home in the middle of the night and saying, I'm going to go to England and become an engineer. And I'm going to figure out how modern, commerce works, or I'm going to figure out how modern law works and help write a constitution or something of that kind. And that's remarkable. And you get people undertaking experiments of these kinds in various ways. Some, it is true, go to England, study, live 3-5 years, come back, and see themselves as out of place. They see themselves as anglicized Indians who are unsure about how to bridge the gap between this quote unquote Western modernity that they've experienced and imbibed, and a more conservative India, often just at home or in their families, that they struggle to kind of reconcile. But there's plenty of people out there that are engaged in trying to reconcile these two stories, to adapt and innovate. They take the Indian classics and try and retell them. They take the Indian philosophical texts, particularly when they relate to statecraft, and they try and think about what in this is essential and important and can last. It will always be, useful, is timeless. And what portions of it, particularly on the social, particularly on the economic side, are outdated. Social and economic structures simply do not look like this, should not look like this. They also morally oppose some of the, the inheritance that they have. But there's much, even in something like the Arthashastra, there are important elements about how politics, how statecraft, how administration should be run, that you see Indian intellectuals grappling with, using, adapting, saying, we shouldn't forget this bit. That bit we can set aside, but this bit is useful. And that's a remarkable process. They're not at all dismissive of their past. They have a cool, calm, critical sort of gaze towards it. And they're willing to take what works and dismiss what doesn't.
And that I guess is the foundation of any intellectual tradition, right? The ability to think, to reinvent, to look at the past through fresh glasses, as it were, when needed. My question with some of this would be, as you doubtless understand, as you know, is that this feeds into some fairly charged debates in modern India about what the sources of our intellectual tradition and our attitudes to our heritage should be. There are, for example, people who argue that almost all of modern Indian intellectual scholarship and historiography is far too deracinated to be of genuine value to India. Your 19th century intellectuals would not have seen the world in quite these terms, right? This would not have mattered to them. They were genuinely global in a peculiar way, far more so than we perhaps are today.
Yeah, I think that might be a very accurate representation in terms of the fact that they were global in their outlook. There's always this danger that we import lessons from the past that are not exactly relevant, and we export from the present debates that didn't quite exist, or they didn't exist in quite the same way back then. I think, as your previous question, alluded to, there was a great deal of intra-Indian, intra-elite debate in the 19th century about how to reconcile the past and the present. And so that was what the fundamental issue was. How much do we take on? How much do we not? It wasn't seen as a binary. It was a scale. It was a spectrum, right? And so one of the key things that I try and emphasize in the book, what I begin with and what I began our conversation today with, was that when we look at, this is a particular sort of bee in my bonnet, when we look at English education and English, the use of the English language in the 19th century, it is a gross error. It is an injustice to our ancestors, to our forefathers, to think that they were compelled to do this stuff, that someone picked them up, put their backs against a wall and said, study English or else. They chose to study English. They asked for schools. They petitioned. Something like 70 to 80,000 inhabitants of Madras signed what was called a monster petition, asking for a school to be created, what is today Presidency College in Madras, that initially started out as Madras High School. Give us a school that will teach us modern science. That's what we want. Why did they want these things? Because their view was it is possible to be both educated in the modern world and to be Indian. And this debate was a similar debate was had in China or in Japan or in Korea. In the same way that Japan can be immensely modern yet immensely Japanese, it's possible to be immensely global and educated and integrated into the international arena, to speak multiple languages and yet be Indian in whatever flavor or variety you express that identity. But we should really resist the temptation to make it oppositional or confrontational. Yeah. Our relationship with the world in the 19th century was not, except for a very small group of people, was not confrontational. It was, conservatives existed across Hindus, Muslims, Parsis. They were conservatives in every group. It's not one, let's not single anyone out. But those conservatives were a very small group, no matter which segment of society you pick. The vast churning, millions, the ones who went to school, the ones, by the middle of the 19th century, there was something like 5,000-6,000 Indians a year. That's a big number for that time. By the 1880s, 15,000-20,000 a year graduating out of universities. These are not small groups. These are not a few families. These are not a few selected nobles. This is the emerging middle class. Yeah. And they all had this give and take relationship with the world. And that's what we should aspire to, or at least that's what we should admire. Whatever we may do, we should admire that about them.
No, I mean, just to speak of personal example, the reason I sit in Delhi, and I suspect this is true of many middle-class Indians, is because I had a grandparent in the 19th century from very similar circumstances who used that education to plow himself out of extreme poverty. Probably was deeply conservative in many of his attitudes and values, yet aware of the world and its opportunities, and really saw no contradiction in seeking those opportunities. Rahul, my final question today really is, as a history student, I find the historians have in bits and pieces touched on some of what you've written about. There's some work in Alter or Zalimi here, there. But by and large, Indian intellectual history of the 18th, 19th century is terrain into which not many have waded. Why has that been so, and what needs to be done about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I think I have at least one answer. And that is that it's been very hard to get material. Some of this story is about the way institutions, archives, libraries work in India. They have many wonderful individuals in them, but as institutions, they are underfunded, poorly organized, poorly managed. And so the ability to access primary sources is limited and difficult. It takes an enormous amount of effort. And the sources that exist and are easily accessible are scattered around the world. So it becomes very difficult for someone, if they want to write intellectual history of the 19th century, to really do more than focus on one individual or one particular group or area. So to tell wider stories, pan-subcontinental stories or pan-Indian stories, it becomes very, very difficult because of the sheer dispersal and scarcity of resources. And there's a sort of second problem, which is if one is that the archives are hard to get to. The second is that the nature or the kind of evidence we should use or rely on is also quite different from what people expect. We often go to intellectual history looking for books about ideas. We expect that we will find tomes or volumes, where's our Montesquieu, where's our Mill, and we find one figure and we fixate on them and we write 500 things about that same one person, endlessly again and again and again, the 15th take on the same person, on the same text. In the 19th century, printing was expensive. It was difficult. Many of the presses were first introduced by missionaries. There were some variations. For example, Tanjore or Travancore brought in presses long before the British did into metropolitan India. But presses were scarce. The number of people that could work presses were very few in number. Paper was expensive. Type was expensive. So it was much easier to publish and to distribute journals and periodicals than it was to write books. There were also linguistic concerns, right? If you wrote a book in English, only a few thousand people could read it. If you wrote a book in a regional language, it couldn't go anywhere because it could only be read in your small, region. And script was not always standardized in most regions in order to produce type. So it was actually, it can be a mistake to go looking for the classic signature text, something that's going to explain the story or capture the century. What we need is a more deft kind of searching for essays, for speeches, for editorials in these newspapers and journals, and for letters that we find to English officials or in the archives. Groups of important figures write petitions, which are not published but are circulated amongst the government and have an enormous impact in British India. They're taken very seriously if they're written seriously with evidence and reason. So if we look at these kinds of sources, and if libraries in India and archives in India help us look at these sources, we will be able to say much more about the 19th century. I can assure you from my own work, I built an archive called Ideas of India that tries to collect this stuff and make it freely available. And I've had great success with it. There are 2,000 or 3,000 people a month that visit the archive and use this material. We need more of that. And we need it institutionalized and systematized, and we'll see more. It can be done. The material is there, but it needs to be looked for and used.
Well, I'll conclude the conversation there, but I'll just add that it has been done. And for those of you looking to understand who we are, I think Rahul's book is absolutely invaluable because it tells us about that period in time when our grandparents and our great-grandparents really began the intellectual journey that made us who we are today. I hope there's some philanthropist watching who is willing to make generous funding, not just for Ideas of India, but other projects to collect, digitize, make our history widely available to the next generation of scholars. And I'll just close here by saying, please go get that book. We have lots of great book shows, but we always have authors complaining that there aren't enough Indians reading. So do yourself a favor, get that book. And Rahul, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Praveen. I really appreciate these lovely questions. Thank you.